Hey everybody, welcome to Mammoth Interactive's YouTube channel. First of all, I want to thank you for watching this video. And remember that this channel doesn't do Patreon. Instead, we sell our digital courses down below. And every single dollar that we get from the products you buy below goes into making more content. The best way to help out this channel and Mammoth Interactive is to subscribe to Mammoth Interactive's huge library of content. Get thousands of hours and hundreds of courses for a low price down below. We have a monthly option and a yearly option. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the video.
Welcome to this course in Advanced JavaScript. Throughout this course, we'll go over quite a few topics. We're going to go over the next generation of JavaScript, in which we have a lot of interesting subtopics as well. We're going to talk about arrow functions that come with ESX, and how they make life a lot easier in some scenarios. And then we'll continue by talking about some ES 2020 features that came new with it. We'll talk about the types of parameters that you can use with functions in some detail, because functions come in really handy. They're basically one of the most important parts of any programming languages. We'll then go on to talk about maps, a data structure that comes in really handy, and is a good alternative to using just objects or creating your own class. Yeah, maps are really useful. And then we'll talk about classes in JavaScript, and we'll talk about them in some detail. We'll also talk about subclasses and inheritance, basically. We'll then move on to asynchronous JavaScript, in which we'll try making some AJAX requests to APIs. We'll talk about promises, async, await, and these other keywords that come in really handy whenever you're programming with JavaScript on the server side, making requests and stuff like that. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. Now you're probably wondering, why should you learn JavaScript? Well, JavaScript is one of the most famous programming languages in the world, and it keeps on growing because of all the frameworks that keep being added to it. Now some of these frameworks are the React.js, Node.js, and AngularJS frameworks. These frameworks have taken web development by its roots, and they're used most widely in these domains. JavaScript is an easy language to learn. And once you build your roots inside JavaScript, you can easily move on to these libraries and frameworks to begin your career as a front-end, back-end, or a full-stack developer. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope I'll see you soon on this course. Go into fetch. Now this is the function that we're using. Inside that I'll just pass the root URL. That's all. Now with that I'll have a .10 function. Now you must have noticed that this is exactly how we used to do good on our promises, and have a response, because that's what we get from a fetch. And inside that response, what we'll do is, on the console log, console.log response. Okay, let's give this a try and see if that even works. If I save that and I go into our browser, go into this top. There, you can see that we have a response. It says type CRS. There's some information with it, and we basically did get a response with some headers and all of that stuff. Now this is our basic HTTP response object, and we don't need the HTTP headers. We want what data came with it, right? So for that, what we're going to do is, you can see that the status is 200. So it was a success. Our responses equal success. There was no redirection, and it went perfectly fine. Alright, so time to get the data out of it. Well, it's quite easy. What we'll do is we'll select .json. Let's try that out now. And we're done. Welcome back. Now there aren't any actual prerequisites for this course, other than just having basic knowledge of HTML and CSS. Now you can probably take this course without having a lot of knowledge of what HTML and CSS are, or being a master in them, but at least knowing how they work will be very helpful. We'll be using the VS Code ID for executing and editing our code. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. In this video we're going to start off with the next generation of JavaScript, ES 2020. First off, we're going to start off by learning how to declare variables using the let and const keywords. Then we'll talk about blocks and IIFEs. We'll also learn about strings in ES 2020. And we'll have a coding challenge to solidify what we've been learning throughout this section. In the next video, we're going to start off by the declaration of variables. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at variable declarations in ES 2020. So let's get started by setting up our file system. Our files, so we'll have an index.html. I'll zoom this in a little because this is probably not visible. So we'll have index.html and we'll have an index.js file. Now inside this index.html, set up some boilerplate, get this out of the way, and we'll insert this to our Advanced JS, and we'll just set up an H1 in here so that we know what's working for Advanced JavaScript. Tutorial. Inside we'll also create a script. And we'll set up source as our index.js. Alright. That's all. Now we can go into our index.js and test this out. We can just console.log. And we'll have this works with a capital H. Yep. That's how I'm going to leave it anyway. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use an extension. Now you can go into these extensions, search for live server and install this. Going to use this extension to quickly run this right from here. Open with live server. It basically hosts index.html on your local server, on your machine, locally. Looks like the H1 isn't working. So just start this. There you go. Now what I want to do is I want to, of course, check that I'm getting this console over here. Get this out of the way. Zoom in a little more. And back in our browser, I've got inspect. Go into our console area. This needs some zoom again. Reload enabled, alright. So we're getting this works. So our JavaScript is linked to our HTML. Now we can go back to our visual code and get started with variable declarations. So throughout our JavaScript course, with the previous JavaScript course, we've looked at the var keyword. And we also use, of course, the let and const a few times, but didn't really go into that much detail of how they work. The var keyword is what came with JavaScript before ES6, but ever since ES6 came out, there have been new keywords called the let and const keywords. And they fixed some issues that came with the var keyword. Now the var keyword, and simple, actually not simple, and the terms to put it in is global scope. Now, global scope means that, well, technically it's global or functional scope, so global scope means that if I declare this var keyword down here, I have var number equals 1, and I set up a function here. And inside this function I create that number equals to name this function temp, and down here the console.log number. Let's try this out. So over here we're creating number 1 and we're redefining it again with the value of 2. And we're console logging it outside of that function, and of course call that function to, over here back in our browser, we're getting 1 now. This is because this function, this variable, this was defined inside the scope. And then it was redefined in this scope. And these two are different from each other, but let's try something else. What if I change this entire thing to if true? We redefine bar number equals 2. We get 10 out of the way. Now in the previous example that we looked at, let's just go back to that for a second. Over here, this number was defined to this function scope, and this one was of global scope. Now, what if instead of a function, we're using an if statement? Now, this number is defined in global scope, and so is this one, because there is no function here where we can define a 2 or string, or 2 in a way. In this scenario, if we went back, we hit reload, we're going to get 2. Now, this is an issue if you don't want this number to be changed by this number. And of course, if this is exactly how you wanted things to work out, you wanted its value to change, then that's perfectly fine. But with ESS, we got a new keyword, the let keyword, and the point was for it to not get redefined out of scope. Now the let keyword is block scope. I'll start writing these things up. Here, var is global or function scope. And we'll have the let keyword. It's based on its block scoped. So let's take a look at the let keyword. First off, if I made both of these numbers let, instantly I notice the first thing here is that this greys out. That's because in the scenario where we were declaring them with var, both the variables were global scope and they were actually just the same variable. It was the same variable being redefined in the global scope, so this one was being this use of the console log. However, now that we have let, we're using this for this console log, and this variable is not being used anywhere, so it's greyed out. Actually, if I copy this console log over here, the word is not grey anymore. How about we console log more than just a number, right? Outside, if I'll have a number, I'll copy this, put it here and inside. I'll hit Control S. It's annoying space out the way. Back in our browser, we already see that inside the f value of flat is 2, outside it's 1. This is because let keyword variables are block scoped. So block scope basically means being inside these curly braces. If we were even to create these curly braces, and we take this console log, put it here, there you go. Now we're not getting access to this number. So if we Control S, go into our browser, and we're getting 1 and both, because this number, this has access to this. Now remember we talked about in the previous course, in the beginner JavaScript course, about how scope chaining works, and this will basically go outside its scope and try to find something that it has access to. Now it won't of course go inside another scope, it can only go outside its scope to broader scopes. So there we have the main difference between the let and the var keywords. So now we've looked at the most major difference between these keywords. Well, another thing is that the let keyword, it also gets hoisted to the top of the code. Now we've talked about hoisting in the previous course. And sudovar variables. The let does show a similar behaviour, but the difference is, it does get hoisted but it doesn't get defined, so you can't exactly use this variable for it. So for instance, if we tried something like console.log number up here, hit save, inside our browser, we're going to get an error, unquote reference error, cannot access number before initialization. And that's because you're not really defining this before console logging it. And this is another difference between the var keyword. Now, if this were a valid, of course, it would have worked. It gives you undefined, but it does work. Next step, let's take a look at the const keyword. So, well, actually, there's one more thing that I want you to look at. Now, I'll get this out of the way. And if we have, of course, I'll get this console log out. We have that number. And again, I set it to 2. Now, this code works perfectly fine. If we console.log works, we're getting a console log. So you can redefine the same variable multiple times with a valid keyword in one scope. What if we made it let? Well, we're going to get an error. This fine number has already been declared. So you can't even redeclare a variable with let in the same scope over and over. You can change its value, of course. You can do this. So that would, of course, work. There you go. But you can just redefine it twice using the let keyword in the same scope. Of course, but we already know this, but let's just let number in a different scope. Now it's going to work perfectly fine. Alright, the next keyword we're going to look at is the const keyword. Now the differences between the const and let keyword are not that many. It's also block scoped, but it cannot be reassigned a value. So can't reassign value. So, for instance, if we had a const number equals 1 and a const number equals 1, now this would give us an error because it shows the same behavior as let. If we put this in a different scope, there, it goes away exactly the behavior that the let keyword was showing us, because this also blocks code. However, the problem here is that although you can't create it in this way, and you can reassign a value to a let variable, you can't do the same with a const variable. So if I try to do this, I change this to 5, we're going to get an error, assignment to constant variable. That is because, as the name suggests, the value of a constant number has to remain constant. There is, however, a different thing that you can do. Now, if this number were actually an object, and we had an object inside that we had name, we'll set that to Jake. With our age, we'll set that to now if we console log obj over here, going to do that. Get this out of the way. Obj. Next, what I'll do is I'll go into our console. Inside our console, if we check the user or we check our user messages, we're getting our object over here. Now, back in VS Code, what I want to do is I want to make a change to this object. What if I want to add object.height equals? Actually, I'll remove that because we're not redefining it. We're just adding a new variable to it. Insert our 5 feet. Okay. Now, back in our browser, are we getting height 5 feet? That didn't give us an error. What if we try to change one of these things then? What if we try to change obj.name, and we'll change that to Donna. So we check our console again. So in our console, well, it does change to Donna. That means the const variable, if you actually make it an object, you can change these things inside. What if we try something else? We try to do obj equals. Inside your space, we'll set let's call it full name, and set that equal to Jake Paul. I hope you all know who that is. Alright, back in our browser. Hit reload, and we're getting an error to constant variable. So you can't reassign it an entire new object, but inside that object you can keep adding things, and you can even change the values of those objects, of the variables inside. So additions, they can be made if you just create them this way. And you can change the values, but you can't redefine the entire object again. So now we know how the const object works, the const variable works. And with that, we're done talking about what's new with variables in ES 2020. And that's all for this video. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at the block scope and IIFEs. Now, what does it stand for? It stands for Immediately Invoked Function Expression. Just write it down here. Immediately Invoked Function Expression. Now, what does that really mean? Well, we'll look at that shortly. First off, we'll start off with blocks, because blocks are really easy, and we've actually looked at them a little in the previous video. Now, blocks, they're basically this. Now, using blocks, you encapsulate things by using the block scope. And the block scope, of course, works with the let and const keywords. So when you want to set some variables to only work in a particular block, you use these two curly braces to define variables that are of course created with the let and const keywords. It won't work with the var keyword because it doesn't block scope. So for instance, if you wanted a variable let string equals hi there, and you only wanted this to be available to anything that is inside those braces, you don't want this string available inside maybe another scope here, or the global scope. Because over here you had another string. That string said bye, and here we have a string that was, well, it says hello word. You wanted all three of these scopes to have different values when they tried to access the string. Now, for instance, if I console log console.long string at here and here, then we'll also console.log string, and of course we'll just do one at the end. But I'll add a few messages to these, so start, put this in here, and copy this so I don't have to make the same mistake over and over. And we'll put this inside block 1. We'll cut Control V. Inside block 2, we'll put end. Now I'm trying to access the same string variable and for console logs. Now this might be a little confusing. Well, I just put these in here, you know, make this code, inside different segments. Okay, so first off, we create a string over here, and we console log it. Then we have scope, block scope over here. We create another string of the same name with the let keyword, and we console log it, and then again, we console log it at the end. Now this console log would of course have access to this string. This console log will have access to this string, and this one will have access to this string. We can try that out. If I hit save, and I go into a browser, and start to get by inside the block. First block you get hi there, in the second block you get hello world, and at the end you get bye again. Now this is basically all there is to block scopes. And you can, of course, it works in the way that it's not only just like inside block, it's you can actually nest blocks inside each other. So actually, instead of putting one in here, I'll just crop this entire block. I'll put this block here, and we're clearly going to get the same thing again. Console log, yep, that works exactly like that. That is because now this is another block nested inside this one. But of course, a different block. What if we remove this let, and now we drop it? Well, now this block doesn't have its own string. So it's going to try to go out of this block to look for a string to console log it. In this scenario, if we go into our browser, hit reload. Actually, we didn't need to hit reload. Inside block 2, we're getting hi there. That's because now, to get the string, our console log went outside the scope, looked for a string in this scope, inside this scope, and it found this hi there. Well, what if we got rid of this one too? Well now, both of these things have to look for a declaration outside their scopes. So this one, it will go outside the scope in this scope over here. They're both now lonely without a let declaration, so they'll both leave this entire scope, go into the global scope, and over there they'll find their string. So in our browser, if you try this out, we're getting by all the way through. So when you can't find a variable declaration in that scope, you basically go out of that scope, JavaScript goes out of the scope, not us. It's a set-defined rule. Now remember that the const variable works exactly like this, but the for variable keyword does not work like this. It had its limitations that we've talked about in the previous video. Now what if we did something else? We get this out of here, and we put it in here. So you'll be thinking, if this could go all the way out of the scope to find that string, can this one go inside our scope? Actually, we'll get this out of the way. Because of course, the declaration is before that. That clearly means they're going to get an error. And well, technically, we're going to get an error this way too, but let's try this out. So you must be wondering, well, we declared let up here, and because the string can't find its own let in scope, so won't it go inside the scope? But it won't. And we can confirm that by going onto our browser. We're going to get the first by, then we instantly get an error. String is not defined at line 10. And here we are at line 10. Now we obviously got an error right here, so we don't even get to this line. But this would give us an error. So we can test that, get these out of the way first. It's safe. Inside our browser, hit reload, and at line 10 we're getting another error, because this is now at line 10 too. So that's pretty much how the block scope works, and now we know how moving through the scopes works. And that's all about blocks. Now let's move to immediately invoked function expressions. Now this concept actually comes in handy for quite a few things, and we'll look at them as we progress through the course. For now, let's try to understand what these really are. So put simply, these are just, well, as the name suggests, these are immediately invoked function expressions. So we create functions, and as soon as they're declared, we invoke them. Now why would we want that? And why wouldn't we just write a normal few lines of code to execute? Well, there are reasons for it that we'll look at throughout this course. And we'll go into our Ajax part of the course. Synchronous, asynchronous JavaScript. You'll understand why we need this when we get to that part of the course covering those topics. And well, how about we learn what this really is? So, the way to declare them will be, I'll create a function first, call this function, start this function. I'm going to console.log. Such a hurry, because of course we're in a hurry to execute this. What I'm going to do is take this entire function, put it inside round braces, put round braces, after this a semicolon. Now, if I hadn't put that, my prettier would have done it for me. Anyway, what I'm doing here is I have now created this thing into an Iife, immediately invoked function expression. So without calling this function, I hit save, go into my browser, I check user messages, I'm getting such a hurry. If I remove this, and this, hit Ctrl S, of course I'm not calling this function, that would make no sense. We're not getting a message. In this scenario, however, we just did. So basically, what I'm doing here is executing a few lines of code instantly without having to call this function. You could of course call this function again, doesn't really limit you from doing this, so if I do temp, seems like I have an error. Uncaught reference data is not defined. My bad. You can't use this function outside because it's also now scoped inside these braces. Let's get that out of the way. And that reminds me now, I made a mistake here. Not really a mistake, but more about something that we don't really need to do. Now I've called this function temp. As you can see, we can't really use that function out there, because we would never really need to use that function out there, because of, well, the reasons why IIFEs exist. You wouldn't really need to use this function you're defining in here anywhere outside. Now the thing is, because you'll never really need to use it anywhere else, and it's just immediately invoked, you don't need to name it, so if we remove that name and we go into our browser, you'll see that it works perfectly fine. And that's pretty much all there is to it, for now. We know the syntax of how to use them and what they really do, so we can really move on to the next part of our building blocks. And we'll try to understand things along the way. And I know it might be confusing as to why you would never really need to use this, but don't worry, we'll learn about this. So that was all for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about strings and ES 2020. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. Now, with the introduction of ES 2020, or ES 11, it was released in 2020, so we're calling it ES 2020, we saw many new improvements to JavaScript. So there are a few functionalities that come in really handy. And of course that's the point, as we progress through newer versions of programming language, is we make it easier for the programmer. Now ES 2020 brought along a lot more than what we're just about to look at. But in the domain of strings, and you all know that as programmers strings come in really handy, you have to use them in so many scenarios, especially when you're working with complex objects that have mostly strings involved. And the worst nightmare is comparing strings. And that is something that, even though JavaScript has made it sort of easier, it's still a nightmare. Of course, almost every basic programming language, of course, tries to make it easier. And JavaScript has made it much easier with ES 2020 again. So what we're getting at, ES 2020 is essentially these two functions, match and match all. Now, these two functions, as the name suggests, basically just give us back whatever we're trying to match with whatever's inside that string. Now, what I'm going to try to do is, I'll start using these. Now, keep in mind that this match returns an object, but match all returns an iterator. And you have to keep creating an iterator over and over again, because that iterator, once this code goes to the end, you can't really take it back to the start. You have to create the entire function called over again. We'll look at that in a few videos and you'll understand what I'm talking about. First, I want to create a constant. I'll call it matches. Set that to... Actually, I haven't created the string first. Const string. Now this string I'll put in hi, hi there, and hi there, there. You're probably wondering why I'm doing that. Well, I have my reasons. So we'll hit save. And we're going to go to console.log .match. Inside match, we'll pass hi. Of course, this has to be a string, and there you go. Now we'll go into our console, and we're getting an object here. Now if I want to make this... there, that's better. So we have an object. Inside that object, we have quite a few things. We have index 0. Now this basically means that we got our first hi at index 0. And then we've input hi there, this entire thing. And we've only got hi over here, so basically we're getting back our first hi that we found at index 0. And that's all. Nothing else is given to us. What if we were looking for something like a scenario where we wanted to check every hi in there? Now, of course, I'll also try something else. I'm going to work with match a little before we move on to match all, which will give us what I just talked about. So, back in code, I'll add there over here. And inside our browser, you can see that we're now at index 3, and we're getting hi there at index 3, because that's what we're searching for. And that's exactly where it is. It's at 0, 1, 2, and 3. That's the third index. If we, of course, kept adding there, it keeps moving on and on to the there we're looking at. There is, however, one more thing I want to try. In this first scenario, what if you wanted to match every single time there was a hi, and there was multiple times thereafter? What if we wanted to find all of them? Do we have an answer to that? If we go into our browser, our visual code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these inverted commas. Now I'm going to use a more basic method of how strings are really used. Now, string expression, what I'll do here is I'm going to take this, going to put it in here, +-g. Now, we don't really need to get into much detail of this because we might not use it so often, but this is basically like a string. What I'm doing here is I'm looking for hi. And then I'm repetitively looking for wherever it's used. So basically, I want this, 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 and this. No matter how many times this is used, I want it returned to me. And I'm going to do that. I'll go into our browser. If we hit reload, actually I don't even need to hit that. But I'm getting here is hi there 3 times, because hi there was matched 3 times with that. And you might notice that this time we're not getting the indexes of where these were actually matched. Now, these are different scenarios that really work with this, with hi there. Would match. And you're noticing a few differences in the different scenarios, the scenarios that we've used it for. And I don't really want to dive too deep into this method or this syntax. But what I want to try now is, I want to change this to match all. Now, if I hit save, I go back into our browser, what I'm getting here is exp string iterator. Now I talked about this, told you that match returns an object, but match all returns an iterator. So what do we do for this? Well, with iterators, we looked at the of keyword. And what we're going to do is, we're going to create a const match of str. Actually, I'm just going to copy this entire thing. Got it. Take this, put it here. And with that, we can look through this iterator. And inside this console log, I'm just going to console log match. Alright? So now if we go back into our browser, I hope you understand this because we've looked at the of keyword before. And we've learned about how our iterators work inside your browser. Now we're getting a whole lot of objects. So first off, what we have here is the hi there search. And we're getting hi there with every single one of them. But we're getting hi there then we're getting hi there, there, then hi there, and we're getting the indexes of all of them. So that's the point of match all. If you wanted complete information of every single match, you would use match all in this case. If you were looking for just one single input, you would use the match operator and you would get all of the index, all the information about that one single index. And if you didn't care about these indexes at all, or any of the other information, you would just use match and do it for multiple objects, multiple instances of that string. So you can see here the differences between what we've been getting so far. Well, of course, the important difference here was that we're capturing there every single time with every result. But it wasn't returned with simple match in the regular expression. So you have to remember these things. And this is technically just a part of the object. So other than that, I'll change the syntax here because it might be a little confusing. If I put hi there, it's Control S, go back to our browser, and now we're getting hi multiple times. Now you can see the difference here is we're actually looking for just hi, so the point was we're finding hi in every single one of these instances. It gives us the index of wherever it was found, hi, so match all did this, and match was giving us only the first one. You can see the difference here between how these two functions work. And you can understand that this clearly opens up ways to a lot of ease in our programming, especially when we're working with long strings. And you're trying to use, a program where string manipulation might be a major task, and you have to do it with a lot of complexity. That's where it could come in handy, for example. So that was all for what we've really seen with ES 2020 strings. There are, of course, other inclusions in it. For instance, I'm actually going to look at one of these. I'm just going to get this out of the way for now. I'll comment this out because it takes a lot of stuff. Now, a very noticeable inclusion was if you create a variable that, and I'll set this to a number, JavaScript has given us is this. You can now separate multiple digits using this operator to make them easily readable. And you can test this out. If we console.log number won't of course give us those separators in between, it will just give us 1,000,000,000. Like if we go into our browser, as you can see, we're getting exactly that number. Now this is a very small, inclusion, but it actually does matter a lot. If you're working a lot with large numbers and you're typing them out, it does get confusing. Now, for instance, if we had this, you would clearly mess up trying to retrieve how many zeros you've put in here, but with these separators, you can tell exactly how many there are. And it can just go on and on and on and on and on. It can be any digit. So not necessarily zeros, of course, could be anything. So yeah, there you go. And this, of course, works and helps in so many scenarios too. If you've extensively worked with programming languages and you've worked on large projects which involve either some sort of numbers like identity numbers and stuff like that, you might notice that this comes in handy. So that was all for this video. In the next video, we're going to have a coding challenge before we move on to the next section. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. So as a coding challenge for this section, what I want you to do is I want you to utilize what we've been learning throughout this section. So we've learned about the string match function, and we've learned about Iifes. So how about let's create a function which uses the string match function. It takes two parameters, and we'll use these two parameters and use the match and match it to the main, and we'll make this function an Iife. Quite simple, and I would suggest that you try this on your own before you watch the next video, and it's alright if you can't figure it out. We'll go through it step by step in the next video. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. So in this video we're going to go over our coding challenge. And I hope you ran into an issue here or a confusion which hopefully you learned a lot from. So first off, what we want is we want a function. So a function, let's name this function matcher. And what it does is it takes two things, it takes a mean and a match. And I call these mean in my strings. And what it does is it uses the string match function, mean string, dot match. And it matches it to the match string. Alright? And it basically will just console.log it here. Now I told you to make this an Iife, but the issue here is you can't really pass parameters into an Iife because it's instantly called. It doesn't really require you to call that function later on. So the solution for that would be to wrap it into one. So how about we create basic syntax of an Iife, and we have a function inside this function. What we're going to do, well, we're going to call our match function. And what we'll do with the match function, we'll send two strings. My name is, we'll have the second string name. So with that we have completed this functionality. And pretty simple really, we used the match function, we called it in an Iife. That's pretty much all there is to it. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you understood what we've been learning throughout this section, and if you were able to do this on your own, that's great. If you weren't, that's also perfectly fine. I actually left in a confusion on purpose so that you had to try to fight your way through it. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. So now that we're done with this section, it's time to summarise it before we move on to the next one. Throughout this section, we've learned quite a lot of the basics of advanced things that we get with JavaScript, such as some new syntax, such as the declare variables, declaration of variables with let and const keywords. We learned about blocks and IISEs, some really handy information. We learned about what came new with strings in IES 2020, and we also had a coding challenge in which we solidified some of the things that we've been learning throughout this section. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. In the next section, we're going to talk about arrow functions. Welcome back. In this section, we're going to go over arrow functions. Now, throughout this section, we're going to learn about the basics of arrow functions, and then we're going to talk about the lexical this keyword. These are really confusing, but once you go over this section, we'll understand completely what all of this is. And we'll also have a coding challenge to really test out what we've learned about our functions throughout this section. That's all for this video. In the first video of this section, we're going to start off with the basics of arrow functions. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back. In this video we're going to take a look at arrow functions. Now, arrow functions came with ESX, and they were a whole new thing that made a lot of things different. And it's really a lot of difference in the syntax. And it's linked with the this keyword. Now, we'll look at this keyword in detail. We've actually looked at this keyword in detail and what it does, so let's get started. What we're going to do first is we'll create a function. Normal function. Now I'm going to declare this function into a variable. So what I'll do is I'll create a constant func, set that to function. Inside this function what we'll do is console.log hello, and we'll return that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to convert this function into an arrow function. Now to convert something into an arrow function, it's really simple. I'll get rid of this function keyword. And instead of start, I'm just going to add an equal to and an arrow over here. So this is the arrow we're talking about, which is the reason why these are called arrow functions. And, well, arrow functions make syntax a lot simpler. And we'll look at that soon. So, for instance, if I remove this return statement, I remove these curly braces, well, I'm writing an entire function in just one line, with no curly braces or anything else. And that's pretty cool, so this made the syntax much shorter. The even cooler thing of what's actually happening here is we're returning something. Now when you don't write those curly braces outside this, what it actually means is that you're returning that statement. So if I remove these, I type something like hi there. Now what's essentially happening here is this function is going to return hi there. When you're working with some of the frameworks of JavaScript or the libraries such as React, you'll notice that this does come in really handy when you want to make your code concise, where you're creating functional components and, well, that's an entire other domain. But if you do jump into it, you'll notice that our functions do come in really handy. Now what's next? What more can we do with our functions? Well, we've already made this so short, but arrow functions, they don't just stop there. Here's another thing that you can do with them. Now we can, of course, insert parameters into a function using these two curly braces, these two round braces. And we could have something here like a string, and the string could, for instance, say there. So maybe we don't need this there anymore. And we'll add the practice, oh my god, we'll add string like this. So now we're returning hi, plus whatever the string we're getting is. Well, if you do have a single parameter, and out of functions, you can just get rid of these, don't even need these. Now, of course, my prettier keeps adding them. Let me just get rid of prettier for a second. So I've turned prettier off for now. And if you're wondering what prettier is, well, it's a code formatter that basically makes my code more understandable. If it's being written in MS, it gives it some, well, organization. So now, as you can see, I've removed those two braces and prettier because it's turned on, it's not messing around with it. In this scenario, I didn't even need laces to cover my parameters. So now, this might look a little confusing for some people. Of course, it can get confusing if you're new, of course, to it. But as you work with functions, with arrow functions, you'll notice that this makes things more simple and less confusing. You're saving a lot of lines of code. And essentially, if you're creating functions that don't do a lot, they're doing something really simple like returning this, or just doing a small task like console logging something or adding two numbers, a lot of scenarios where you would only want a single line of a function, you can keep calling this function wherever you want. So it's of course a normal function that will work exactly. All functions work with just a little different syntax. Now these are some of the minor differences between normal functions and arrow functions. These are basic visual differences in syntax, however, there are some major differences between functions and arrow functions. Now what is it? What is the difference? Well, the difference is exactly the this keyword. We talked about this keyword before. And what the difference here is, in arrow functions, there is, well, no binding of this. So what does this mean? Well, in regular functions, this keyword used to represent the object that called the function. So it could have been like, there are a million scenarios that could have been the window or the document or a button or any object that calls the function. However, with arrow functions, this keyword is always going to be binded to the arrow function itself. Now that probably sounds confusing, but we'll go through this, we'll write a few lines of code, and we'll understand what this really means. Now first off, I want to turn prettier back on because I like my code formatted. And there you go, it started those again. Well, I'll tell you what prettier actually is. See, when I do this, if I hit Control-S, it was back up there, prettier, took out the unnecessary code. It's an extension, you can add it from the extensions, just search here for prettier. And there you go, prettier code formatter. Well, back to the topic. So what I want to do is I want to create some code in my index.html. And I should add defer here because now I'm going to create some things. Now, defer really does, it's going to run this line of code at the end of everything else, so it has a lot of its users. So for instance, first off, defer. The best part is that if it's executing this at the end, we'll get all our HTML loaded out on the page. So if you're accessing a page and it starts loading out too much, it might be because of the JavaScript or any other scripts embedded into it. So if you defer, it goes to the end, and it doesn't run before the rest of the HTML. So you get the page first, then it starts loading. The second best thing is if I create anything here. There are too many things, like I have an H1 now. And sorry, start H1. I actually had an H1 there. I guess I deleted it at some point. Well, and we had an ID of, we'll call it demo, or we'll call it header. And we have a header, we'll call it JavaScript. Our Advanced JavaScript tutorial. If you wanted access to this ID, and you don't choose defer, this could lead to issues sometimes. You don't get access to this H1 because it was created after the script was being, processed. Next, I also want to create a button here, and I will give it an ID of clicker, I don't know. I will call it click me. Now what's next? Well, we have our two things. We go into our browser, you can see that we have an Advanced JavaScript tutorial header. And the script, we can click it, but what I really want to do is I want to create a few things. So what you want to do is create a function on an arrow functions. First we'll create a function hello. Hello world, I'll just call it simple. Function equals function. And inside that function, we'll have document.getElementById. And we'll have demo. This is... Actually, I named it something else. Header and limit header. Inside that, I'll have in an HTML. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add to this HTML with this talk. I'm going to copy this, Control-C, Control-V. Arrow function. The const keywords here. Const. Get rid of this. And just leave those in for now. Okay, now we have a simple function, and we have an arrow function. They're doing exactly the same thing. They're accessing the header. And inside its inner HTML, it's adding this to it, whatever this is right now. Now we just need to add, this function to the button, and we'll go document.getElementById, and our button is called clicker, I believe. Yep, clicker. Event listener. And the event we'll do is, of course, the click event. And we'll add hello. I do apologize for that annoying box that shows up. Okay, so we get clicker. We are an event listener to click, which doesn't use a hello function here. It uses the simple function. Alright, so we've currently binded our pattern to this simple function, the arrow function. Now, let's go into our browser. Inside our browser, hit reload. We're not getting any errors. Get this out of the way. Little way to click me. The second I clicked it, what it does is it creates, it adds to the inner HTML of our header. It added the object HTML button element. How is that happening? Well, in this function, we call document or getElementById, And that element, that header, it called this function. But actually we're not even getting this button. Oh, my bad, my mistake. What I've done is this entire function, it adds to the HTML of the header. What's happening here is, what's calling that function? Well, the button is calling that function. So essentially what we've done here is we've used our button to call this entire simple function. And because of that, because the object calling the function was the button, this got called using this code binded to our button. And that is why when we added to the inner HTML, we were adding our button tag. So as you can see, our object HTML button element. Let's try this with the arrow function. What difference would that make? So arrow function, we hit save, go into our browser, reload, just, making sure that it works. I'll hit click me. Now it's getting object window. Why is that so? Well, that's because now this is actually binded to the owner of that function. And the owner of this function is currently, well, the global scope, the window object. If this were inside the class, of course, then the owner would be that scope, or whatever's inside. But for now, because we're adding this using an arrow function, this wasn't even really strung to this function. It was actually binded to the owner of this function. If you look at it in a way, this was actually the same for this scenario. Like, it wasn't really binded to something in here, it was binded to the owner of this function, which in that scenario was this object. For that scenario, but for an arrow function, the owner wasn't really defined by where it's being called, it's defined by where it was defined. So the global scope over here, that is this in this case, now all that might sound a little confusing, and honestly, it just... Now all that might sound a little confusing, but that's perfectly fine. You don't really need to understand this in that much detail, just know how this keyword works, and remember how in different scenarios you would use it differently. So that was all about arrow functions, against simple functions. In the next video, we're going to talk about the lexical this keyword. So we're going to go in a little more detail of this keyword, one of the most confusing things of any programming languages. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you soon.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this course. If you want to watch the rest of the course, the link is down below. Not only will you get the access to this course, but you'll get access to a lot of other courses in a huge bundle, and it's on sale today. So buy it before the sale ends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.